Jerico, Bryl, Intal from P to XX. So, our topic for today is all about only directional movement. So, huwag na natin patagalin to. This is directional movement presenting anatomical terms of movement.
What is anatomical terms of movement? Anatomical terms of movement are used to describe the actions of muscles upon the skeleton. Muscles contract to produce movement at joints, and the subsequent movements can be precisely described using this terminology.
Terms used assume that the body begins in the anatomical position. Most movements have an opposite movement, also known as antagonistic movements. Therefore, we have 23 types of anatomical terms of movement or directional movements, such as flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, and so on and so forth. So let's start. Let's differentiate the 23 types of anatomical terms of movement, starting by the flexion and extension. Flexion and extension. Flexion and extension are movements that take place within the sagittal plane and involve anterior or posterior movement of the body.
Flexion is an anterior bending of the neck or body. Extension involves a posterior directed motion such as straightening from flexed position or bending backward. So again, this is flexion, extension.
Extension. Hyperextension is the abnormal or excessive extension of a joint beyond its normal range of motion.
So this is the hyperextension.
Abduction and adduction. Abduction and adduction is a motion occur within the coronal plane and involve medial lateral motions of the limb, fingers, toes, or thumb.
Abduction moves the limb laterally away from the midline of the body. Adduction is the opposing movement that brings the limb toward the body or across the midline. So this is abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction.
Circumduction is a movement of the body region in a circular manner in which one end of the body being moved stay relatively stationary while the other end describes a circle.
So this is the circumduction.
Rotation. Rotation of the neck or body is the twisting movement produced by the subluxation of the small rotational movements available between adjacent vertebrae.
Medial rotation, movement that brings the anterior surface of the limb toward the midline of the body. Lateral rotation, rotation of the limb so that the anterior surface moves away from the midline. So again, this is lateral, medial, lateral, medial.
Supination and pronation. Supination and pronation are the movements of the forearms that go between these two positions.
Pronation is the motion that moves the forearm from the anatomical position to the palm backward position. Supination is the opposite motion in which rotation of the ridges returns the bones to their parallel positions and moves the palm to the anterior facing position. Pronation, supination.
Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion are movement at the ankle joint, which is the hinge joint.
Dorsiflexion, lifting the front of the foot so that the top of the foot moves toward the anterior leg. Plantar flexion, lifting the heel of the foot from the ground or pointing the toes downward. This is dorsiflexion, plantar flexion.
Inversion and eversion. Inversion and eversion are complex movements that involve the multiple plane joint among the tarsal bones of the posterior foot, and thus is not a motion that takes place at the ankle joint.
Inversion is the turning of the foot to angle the bottom of the foot toward the midline. Eversion returns the bottom of the foot away from the midline. This inversion, eversion, inversion, eversion.
Protraction and retraction. Protraction and retraction are anterior-posterior movements of the scapula or mandible.
Protraction occurs when the shoulder is moved forward, as when pushing against something or throwing a ball. Retraction is the opposite motion with the scapula being pulled posteriorly and medially toward the vertebral column. So again, in this protraction and retraction, this is the protraction, retraction.
Elevation and depression. Elevation and depression are upward and downward movement of the scapula or mandible.
Elevation, the upward movement of the scapula and shoulder. Depression, downward movement of the scapula and shoulder. Elevation, depression.
Excursion. Excursion is the side-to-side movement of the mandible.
Lateral excursion moves the mandible away from the midline toward either the left or right side. Medial excursion returns the mandible to its resting position at the midline. This is lateral, medial, lateral, medial. Opposition is the thumb movement that brings the tip of the thumb in contact with the tip of a finger. Reposition, returning the thumb to its anatomical position next to the index finger. Reposition, opposition, reposition.
Well guys, that is the 23 types of anatomical terms of movement or the directional body. I hope may nakuha kayong mga aral at mga bagong trivia. So hanggang dito lang tayo. Again, I'm Jerico from Intal from PE to XX. Have a good day.